All right, so the last thing we just need some feedback on concerns grading and grading policy. So, this is what I'm most excited about because I feel like it can totally change the landscape of how we do things. So, one of the things that Erin mentioned while we were kind of at the end of our day when we were going through our BLT process was that our grading practices don't necessarily accurately reflect student learning all of the time. So, what we know is that when we do a unit or a novel and it takes a month to get through, we know by, day 10, if kids haven't done anything, that they're going to fail. But in the meantime, it looks like they have an A, and then all of a sudden we put that summative in and it's an F. So, one of the tweaks that she thought about was if we put formatives in Infinite Campus as summatives until kiddos take the summative, and then the formatives become formative grades, and the summative then is the only one counted in the grade. What that would do is it would mean that all of the formatives that we took would actually have weight. So if a kid didn't do something in class or didn't get something turned in on time, it would go in Infinite Campus and it would become a failure, right? So that would give us leverage with parents. It would be a better communication tool with parents. It would give us leverage with students. Or like think about our grammar formatives. If you failed a grammar formative, you obviously need to come in for enrichment time to get some reteaching before you take that summative or before even you take the next formative. Um, and so kids would have the opportunity to increase and better those grades. But if we have a kid that's not doing anything, we are actually going to start accurately communicating that throughout that month rather than waiting to when we get to that summative. So for me, I think, especially for us in the English world, that this is transformative. That if we are going to do To Kill a Mockingbird, we can put in more summatives. Like after part one, Jamie did a great job of having a writing prompt for kids to tackle. But those formatives along the way, all those journal prompts, all of those kinds of things get entered into the kids' grade until they take that summative. What that means on the teacher end of things. One, we're going to have to start entering all of our formative assessments into Infinite Campus pretty religiously. That's one of the goals I have for myself this year, so that way we have an accurate count of where kids are. Two, it would also mean for us fiddling more with Infinite Campus. It means that when you put something in, initially you would put it in as a summative, and then once you enter the summative grade, you'd go back to that and change it into a formative. And you should just be able to do that with the drop down menu. Darcy is making sure that there are no other complications to that because if it's a multi step process, I don't think that's something that's going to be sustainable for most teachers. But I think it could be really impactful for our kiddos. Like I'm thinking about parent teacher conference time when all we have in is maybe a grammar summative or we have like their first part of their research project. Or like what Jamie did with the research project. She made each what like the introduction was a summative. You could do all of that and then make all of those pieces formative when they turn in the final draft. So it would help keep kids on track and be able to communicate to parents like, "Hey, your nugget's not keeping up." So when we had this conversation, I was super all for it. But we want to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences. So things like when we are calculating the F list, what would that look like? Would we be able to sort between actual summatives that kids are failing and formatives kids are failing? We don't think that we can. And so, does that matter? Would it help with intervention stuff with the kids that we're pulling on a frequent basis? How do we prioritize kids who have failed a summative versus ones who have failed a formative, and what does that look like? We're struggling with like some sorting ideas, like how do we figure out what kids are like missed a formative because they were absent? And so once they get it taken care of in enrichment, it'll be fine. And our kids that we need to talk about in SAT because they have a pattern of not doing work. So we're struggling with that sorting part of things. does that impact your life greatly? For me, I don't feel like it does. But I could be wrong. I could be totally, maybe I'm not using the F list the way it's intended. The other thing that we would have to consider is that eligibility would change. The eligibility currently is only calculated at semester, but we could actually start calculating eligibility more frequently. So that could be problematic for our kiddos who generally wait till the last minute, squeak it out at the end, and are still eligible. They wouldn't be eligible during that season or during that performance time. And so, is that we're placing academics over extracurriculars at that point and maybe using extracurriculars as a leveraging tool? That can be positive. It can also be negative. If you're a coach who has, or a drama director who has put somebody in a part who then just hasn't finished their formative, they might be, if it's at that cutoff point, they might be ineligible. When do you think would be fair to calculate eligibility? So we have a lot of like concerns, but I feel like it's a better way to communicate with students and parents how kids are actually doing in class and to make what we do in class matter. So, for instance, those journal entries, kids would be like, oh, well, they're just formative, I don't care. They wouldn't have that option anymore. The other issue that we talked about grading wise is going to a more standardized procedure with making sure that kids have all of their formatives finished before they take the summative or before the summative is calculated. That would be easier to do, I think, under this system. And then lastly, we also talked about that 2-week window. So once the summative is due, you have, or graded, whichever you prefer, you have 2 weeks to reassess. And then if you don't, it stays an IE. Is that something you're interested in? Not so much. I know that I've had it in my syllabi before, but I've been poor about following up with it. Is that something that's supported or not? And I asked the question at the time, so that means we'll have kids fail because of timeliness. And Aaron was like, yes. So that has to be something that we're comfortable with as well. So just some comments about feedback, about grading policy. Firstly, about formatives going into summatives and then turning to formatives once the summative is completed, if you're okay with that. Secondly, it was about calculation of eligibility and what that looks like and feels like. And then lastly, what window of time do we want to give kiddos to reassess and what does that look like? So kind of those three aspects, mostly on number 1, but 2 and 3 of their major concerns for you. Sorry, this is so long.